All right, that is 3 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to this year's NNP Symposium. This is the third year that we have worked with Central States, so we have viewers here in person in Schaumburg, as well as online live streamed through Zoom. This presentation is being given remotely by Douglas Mudd, who is right up here on the screen. The symposium itself, all of the speakers and the organization and the live streaming is sponsored by the Eric P. Newman Numismatic Education Society. Our physical space here in Schaumburg is sponsored by Heritage. So very grateful to both of them for letting this happen. For viewers online, you will be able to ask questions at the end during the Q&A, so you'll be able to participate fully just as if you were here. And for the people in the room, our speaker has suddenly gotten quieter and we don't know why. So we have closed captionings turned on the screen up here. I can make them bigger if anyone needs me to, or you can move closer to the front of the room. We're doing our best. It's been all right, so you should be able to hear, but that's where we are. So we have Douglas Mudd up here. He has lived in Peru, Taiwan, the Philippines, Bolivia, Syria, and Mexico before finishing high school in Virginia. He has a master's in American history and has previously been the collection manager of the National Numismatic Collection at the Smithsonian. And he is now the curator and museum director of the Edward C. Rochette Money Museum at the ANA. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Doug, for the Silk Road's Money in Motion. Let's make sure that your audio is working before I walk away.
Okay. Thank you, Leanna. That's a great intro. And is it working?
We are good to go. Take it away.
Excellent. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk. This is a preview of an exhibit that we're going to be opening on June 26th at the Money Museum in Colorado Springs. And we're currently still in the process of preparing and making this happen. But this covers a lot of the material that'll be in there. And as you see, we show the Silk Road's Money in Motion, and we're focused on the land routes for this presentation. So, welcome to a first look at the Edward C. Rochette Money Museum's newest exhibit opening this June. We're going to embark on a journey of commerce, culture, and connections made possible through coinage. And the Silk Road, or more accurately, roads, which link the ancient civilizations of Eurasia, is a simple term for a very complicated web of interconnected trade routes. Connecting diverse civilizations from east to west, these routes fostered the exchange of goods and ideas for more than 1,500 years. Along the way, diplomats and travelers exchanged far more than silk, despite the name. Spices, textiles, plants, animals, religions, technologies, and even diseases traveled with merchants and armies, permanently altering the cultures that they encountered along the way. Straddling three cradles of civilization, China, India, and Mesopotamia, the Silk Road developed in tandem with commercialized imperial superpowers. So these are large empires that not only were highly organized and interested in commercial trade, they also had their own monetary systems uh, and an organization that could foster long distance trade. And we'll discuss these empires as we go through the talk. But to start with, the background is from the west, we have Macedonia's Alexander the Great, who forged a vast empire and spread Hellenic culture, coinage, and language to the borders of India. After his death, his realm fractured, and Rome gradually absorbed much of his territorial legacy, building a new empire that lasted from basically 27 BC to 1453 AD. Concurrently, the Hellenistic civilizations of Central Asia, splinters of Alexander's vast domain, succumbed to invading nomadic peoples from the steppes who established the Parthian empires, followed by the Sasanian after the Parthians, the Kushan Empire, and these two places became critical elements in the development of the Silk Road network. When you add to that the development of the Han Chinese empire, all of these places coalesced more or less in the second and first centuries BC and created a zone all the way across Eurasia that for the first time was under the control of organized sedentary empires capable of protecting merchants as they went over these vast distances. So now, follow me on this Silk Road's adventure. So, to begin with, let's talk about trade in the ancient world. Trade has been vital to civilizations all over the world and across history. It's always made an important contribution to national wealth and, in some cases, national survival. For thousands of years, trade routes were the communications conduits of the ancient world. Long distance trade played a much more important role in cultural, religious, and artistic exchanges at that time than it does in our modern world. They didn't have computers, they didn't have the internet, all of the other paraphernalia of modern technology, including things as old-fashioned to us now as the printed word on in books didn't exist. So the best ways that you can communicate back in the ancient world was word of mouth, face-to-face encounters, the creation of stone monuments, the use of clay tablets, uh, and the simple town crier in order to pass news. So it was a very different world than we think of today. One of the key elements of that world was numismatics, but we'll talk about that later, since coins were a one of the early ways of mass communication because you could actually put a message on them that could be carried exactly as you wanted it to be used across a vast distance or large numbers of people. And that becomes one of the key elements of the Silk Road. By the beginnings of the first century AD, merchants, diplomats, and travelers could cross the ancient world from Britain to Spain in the west to China and Japan in the east, but it wasn't easy. Some areas had a monopoly on certain materials or goods. China, for example, supplied West Asia and the Mediterranean world with silk, while spices were obtained principally from South Asia. The West shipped gold, wine, glass, and silver to India and points east. Um, the basic requirements for the development of the Silk Road were contiguous empires large enough to span the majority of the routes and with enough power and interest in trade to provide security, stable currency that was acceptable along the whole of the trade network, and trade goods with enough demand at either end to make the hazards of the Silk Road worth the risk, because those hazards were great. Not only did you have terrain uh, ranging from the Himalayas and some of the greatest mountain ranges in the world to some of the driest and most dangerous deserts in the world as well. So this is no easy picnic. Traveling the Silk Road was easily and is today easily romanticized, but the reality was perilous. Skirting dangerous barriers such as the Taklamakan Desert or the Pamir Mountains and other places, it was no highway. There wasn't even a dirt road at the time. You had trails. In some cases, the descriptions by Chinese explorers and um, adventurers talked about trails along the mountains that were uh, all of 16, 18 inches wide with steep precipices on one side. And this trail would last for a kilometer or more. So not something simple to do when you're trying to carry large amounts of goods and supplies. Merchants relied on caravan cities like Samarkand, Kashgar, and Bukhara to provide havens along the way. However, the economic rewards outweighed the danger and risk as long as there was a reasonable chance of making it to the next stop and there was a demand for the items you had for trade. Paving the way, coins provided a portable, standardized medium of exchange that relieved the burden of barter. Made from precious metals, they bridged the trade gap between the West's demand for exotic luxuries like silk and the East's limited desire for Western products. Issued as currency and propaganda, coins spread messages of imperial power, divine legitimacy, and prominence. As tangible pieces of history, they reveal the intricate web uh, of trade routes and political ties between the empires. These empires and their currency were critical in creating the conditions which made the Silk Road network possible. Now, let's go on to a numismatic overview. So we'll talk just very basically about Greek coinage and their tradition. The first Greek coins were produced during the 7th century BC in Asia Minor. These coins were likely produced by merchants when they began to mark lumps of electrum in order to avoid reweighing them for each transaction. But the kings of Lydia soon adopted the idea, beginning the tradition of state-issued coinage that has continued to this day. With the invention of coinage came one of the most historically important uses of money, money as a means of communication through its designs and legends. A nation's money is often the first impression a visitor gets of the nature of a country. As such, the designs and legends placed on money have always been considered important by the authorities responsible for their issue, making money critically important to the study of history. For historians, this is how we figure out what people believed in, what they wanted to project as an image, and also dating. This is one of the especially important areas. This is especially true before the age of the printing press, when options for disseminating information were limited, labor-intensive, and expensive. From simple tools of trade and markers of value, money is developed through the invention of coinage into declarations of independence and power, something that they're still used for today. As we know, one of the very first things that a newly independent country does is issue money. And this is despite the fact that in some cases the money will probably be worthless from the start. But the fact that you can issue money shows that you're independent and not a colony or anything else of that sort. So we'll go on to look at these coins in the perspective of each of these empires as we move through. Now, the other cradle of civilization was the Indian Indus River Valley, and they also produced coins at a very early date. They first appear in the northwestern portions of the subcontinent in the provinces controlled by the Achaemenid Persian Empire. These small silver ingots are known as punch-marked coins or karshapana. Instead of being struck, they were produced with designs punched onto one side or two sides, both sides, with a set of punches rather than a set of dies covering the whole of the planchet. They have been found from Afghanistan into southern India and were in use for centuries. An interesting feature of these coins is that they seem to have been issued by individual merchants and bankers and not a government. Often they were apparently issued by merchant guilds or various guilds associated with woodworking or other production type things like medieval guilds in Europe. During the 3rd century BC, the Bactrian Greeks took control of much of northeast India in the wake of Alexander's conquest, establishing several independent kingdoms that issued Greek-style coinage with significant modifications, such as the use of square coins and, for the first time, bilingual inscriptions, so coins that appeared with Greek on the obverse and Kharoshthi on the reverse. Later Indian coinage was produced by multiple kingdoms throughout the subcontinent, each with its own characteristics. And then we have the Chinese money tradition. The first Chinese objects that can be called coins are the bronze spade and knife money, along with a couple of other different designs, including bell types and bridge money, that were first produced around the 7th through the 6th centuries BC and onwards. At about the same time that coinage first appeared in Asia Minor, these pieces were starting to be used as a form of money. One of the clues as to them being used as money is that spade and knife, for example, were both originally fairly large and approximated an actual spade and could be used as such. As time went on, they got smaller. They lost, in the case of the spade, the hollow handle because you didn't have to put a handle on anymore because you weren't using it as a spade. And they became thinner and much less usable as a tool, but much more convenient to use as money. These first coins were followed by what became the basic form for Chinese coinage for the next 2,300 years, a round cast metal disc with a hole in the center. These coins, these pieces that appear as coins to us, uh, appeared when the Qin dynasty unified the whole of the Chinese civilization for the first time in 221 BC. Chinese money settled on this single form, the classic round banliang, which means translates as half ounce coin with a hole in the middle. These coins incorporated a two-character legend simply identifying the weight, and there were two varieties initially. There was a round hole variety, which was first introduced during the Warring States period from about 475 to 221 BC. And then the Qin dynasty created the square hole variety in 221 BC. Now we will go on to some background for the empires. Now, for the first Silk Roads era, which starts roughly in the first century BC and continues through the third to the end, roughly the end of the third century AD, Alexander the Great's empire was long gone, but it created the foundation that became the backdrop for the Silk Roads and created a culture that had a unifying element in the Hellenic culture that was disseminated through his empire. So, Alexander was of Macedon, was known as Alexander the Great today, is one of history's most renowned military geniuses. At 20, Alexander ascended his father's throne and swiftly embarked on an extraordinary campaign to build one of the ancient world's largest empires, beginning in Greece and then incorporating Egypt and Persia and stretching as far as India. Alexander's conquests fundamentally reshaped the political and cultural landscape of the known world. His dream was to create more than just an empire of conquest. He envisioned a fusion, of the cultures of the peoples throughout his realm, united with a Greek or Hellenistic overlay. Founding dozens of cities, Alexander spread Hellenistic culture and ideas throughout his dominions, influencing art, science, and philosophy for centuries to come. At his death, at the age of 32, without a clear successor, he plunged his empire into uncertainty and division, which changed history but allowed for the development of multiple empires in his wake. One of the things that he introduced that changed the appearance of money forever throughout the areas where his empire existed was a unified coinage minted at multiple mints across a vast region, which in some cases provided the first experience of monetization for some of the cultures that were part of his empire, and in other cases provided a stabilized and unified system of money for the first time. So this coinage was produced from the enormous hoarded wealth of the Persian Empire. For example, the treasury of Persepolis alone, one of the Persian capitals, had over 3,000 tons of gold and silver in one hoard. Alexander's coinage was the most extensive and uniform in the ancient world before the establishment of the Roman Empire, and his coinage consisted of gold staters and double staters, as you see here, and silver tetradrachms, drams, and token bronze coins. So it was intended to cover the complete gamut from the smallest transactions all the way up to the large long distance transactions, money that would be used for long distance transactions, and the payment of armies and large sums of money. These coins were unique for the time in that they were produced with the same designs at dozens of mints located throughout the empire, which took quite a bit of organization. You had to make sure that everybody had models for the designs and were able to keep up with whatever changes that might occur, along with identification to identify which mint they came from. Um, and these coins were all designed with a message in mind. Uh, his tetradrams and drams, for example, reflect his mythical ancestry. The obverse features the head of Hercules with the skin of the Nemean lion. Uh, Hercules was claimed as one of Alexander's ancestors, and since Hercules was the son of Zeus, chief of the Greek gods, Alexander placed Zeus enthroned on the reverse of his coins, holding an eagle, which was Zeus's avatar. Thus, Alexander celebrated his relationship to divinity and his right to rule. After his death, his coinage was widely imitated, including by his successors. Alexander's likenesses on their coins served as a confirmation of their right to rule by their connection with Alexander. And more fascinating are the non-Greek copies, which over centuries diverged from the standard designs, creating wonderfully complex and cultural fusions. And we'll see some of those as we move along. So next we have the Seleucid Kingdom. So the Seleucid Kingdom was initially the largest of the three major successor kingdoms that followed the breakup of Alexander's original empire. And it was by far the largest initially, but it slowly broke apart over time. When Alexander's empire was split between his generals at his death, 4 decades of civil wars was the result. And these three major kingdoms, the Macedonian original, based on the original Macedonian kingdom, the Seleucid Empire, and the Ptolemaic Empire, were the critical three that lasted for a few centuries after his death. And they're collectively known as the Hellenistic kingdoms because their main unifying element is this Hellenistic civilization based on the Greek language and Greek culture, particularly the Athenian Greek uh, heritage, to link all of them together, creating a language for diplomacy, but also a language that was adopted uh, by the elites and even the middle class, and in some cases even down to the whole population in some areas. And here's their coinage. You can see it resembles Alexander's coinage quite a bit. Basically, um, in 306 BC, the successors to Alexander began to issue coins in their own name rather than the fiction that was held before then, that they were holding their portion of Alexander's empire for his wife and child, who were killed basically in, I think it was 308 BC. So once it was clear there was no succession to Alexander, each of the rulers of these three kingdoms decided to break loose and declare their own dynasties. Seleucus was the last of the original three breakaway kings or emperors to give up the use of Alexander's name. And you can see that he continued with the basic idea that Alexander established. He presented his own image, his successors followed in that same mold, and then they would have their title as King Antiochus or King Seleucus, and they would have imagery that would reflect either their accomplishments or some aspect of their rule that they thought was important. So this use of realistic portraiture by the rulers of the Hellenistic kingdoms was the final numismatic element introduced by the Greeks before the advent of the Roman Empire. These portraits formed the foundation from which Roman imperial coinage would develop from the 1st century BC until the end of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. So Alexander left Greek and Macedonian settlers and cities scattered throughout the Middle East and Central Asia. The easternmost and one of the most powerful and least known of these splintered kingdoms was Bactria, which became independent from the Seleucid Empire during the mid 3rd century BC. Around the 250s, they broke away and formed their own kingdom, which creates all sorts of interesting and fascinating possibilities when you think about what was going on. Because soon afterwards, they would be cut off from the Western world altogether by nomadic uh, confederations at different times, including the Parthians, uh, which meant that you had this highly developed Greek culture in the middle of Central Asia on the edge of India, um, which creates all sorts of fascinating possibilities, especially the idea of uh, one of them, Menander, actually converted to Buddhism. And you can imagine Indian uh, leaders of the time under the Mauryans and later having discussions of philosophy using Socrates and Aristotle and talking about Buddha and other philosophers of the Eastern world. The legacy that was left by the middle of the 1st century BC, when the Bactrians lost control of their kingdom in Afghanistan, was a series of kingdoms that was in what is today Pakistan, uh, which became the precursors to one of the critical empires of the first era of the Silk Roads, the Kushans, and we'll get to them later. Here's the Bactrian coinage. These coins are amongst the most technically highly skilled engravings of Greek coinage with some of the just wonderful portraiture. And as I had mentioned earlier, very soon they began to show bilingual legends for the first time in numismatics. So, for example, the lower left coin is uh, King Menander, the Savior King, and you see on the reverse, you see Athena Promachos, a standard image of Athena, but the language on the reverse is Kharoshthi, which is a native language of the region, and it says basically exactly the same thing as the Greek says on the obverse. So this was intended for a mixed population. One of the key elements of the Silk Road was this melding, fusion of various cultures to create a unique new uh, culture in Central Eurasia that continued for many centuries. Now we'll get to the Parthians. So the Parthians um, were heirs to Alexander's empire through conquest. Uh, they created an empire which, at its height, presented Rome with a serious challenge for the control of the Middle East, and they were the only civilized power to withstand the might of Rome at its height. Some of the greatest defeats ever experienced by the vaunted Roman legions were at the hands of the dreaded Parthian horse archers and cataphracts. In fact, it is said that the Roman matriarchs would use the boogeyman of the Parthian as a way of scaring their children into obeying. Uh, when you had to put them to bed, or all the standard things that you try to get your kids to listen to you with. In 238 BC, Arsaces I defeated the Seleucid governor of Parthia and established the Parthian kingdom. The Parthians weren't known as the Parthians initially. They were part of a tribal group called the Parni, who were part of the Scythian confederation of tribes that had moved into the region of north and around the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And it turns out that the first area that they conquered that uh, was the province of Parthia, which had been part of the Achaemenid uh, Empire and was also part of the Seleucid Empire. And outsiders began to call them the Parthians because they were associated with that region when they first came to the attention of the Greeks and Romans. So they were famed for their horses and horsemanship, as well as hunting, warfare, and drinking, which were the typical uh, stereotype skills of the nomadic or the militarized nomadic steppe peoples. And after conquering Parthia and the other areas that were dominated by Greek culture, the Parthians adopted a veneer of Hellenistic culture themselves, which they never allowed to overcome their nomadic origins, however. Even after 500 years of ruling one of the oldest civilized regions of the world, Parthian kings in the third century, the early third century AD, were still expected to be superb horsemen and warriors. They had to be able to ride horses from the time they could walk and shoot a bow while at the gallop in order to be respected as a ruler. And here you have some of the examples of the coins, and you can see the very first coins feature a an image in the Greek style, but a very un-Greek image. Uh, the person is wearing earrings and has a bashlik, or the a stereotypical nomadic felt cap, which had a fold over top and then uh, a tie that goes down the front and a neck cover as well to keep warm. But interestingly, they add Greek elements such as the tiara, the Greek ribbon that was used tied around the head. Uh, it was a white ribbon that was used to show kingship. This was the Greek idea of what we consider a crown. If you wear one of these with a tie at the back, that shows that you are a king. And they kept that element throughout their period of ruling this area. All of their coins show their kings wearing this diadem. So you see the development from the early image where there's Arsaces himself represented with himself also on the reverse, sitting on a throne and examining a bow. That image would remain the standard image for the vast majority of their coinages throughout their period in control of the region. But there were changes. So Mithridates I, who was the great conqueror who conquered Mesopotamia, became more Hellenized and began to show himself as a Greek ruler almost, with the exception of the beard, which was unusual for the time for a Greek. But this image is very much, this is the image to the right on the top. Uh, it very much looks like a Greek sort of image. As time went on, however, they changed their styles. Occasionally, you would see frontal images, and on the lower left, you see this image of the facing portrait with hair and a style that was very un-Greek, but very standard for the Iranian regions and or the Persian parts of Central Asia. And then you get the later Parthians where they move away from the Hellenized styles and adopt a very Eastern looking linear style with it, which occasionally is very skillfully done. This is not necessarily a decline in the skills and workmanship. There are examples that are very, very well done. And it represents more a move towards a different artistic ethic. And this coin dates from the last emperor, the last king of kings of the Parthians, Artabanus VI. So the Parthians used several standard coinages. The dram was their standard coin used throughout their empire and throughout the period of their rule. It was issued in many mints and was a silver coin. They never did produce any gold coins that we're aware of. There are some uh, counterfeits of gold coins that exist, but we've never been able to determine that they were genuine issues. As far as we know, the Parthians never issued gold coins, but they did introduce tetradrams that were produced at Seleucia, which was a major Greek city along the Tigris River that became one of the largest cities in the world at one point in the in the first century BC. Um, and it produced a large range of tetradrams for the Parthian Empire uh, throughout its history. Now we'll move on to Rome. So with Rome, it was Rome was a military power that grew from a small village in the center of Italy into a major empire by fits and starts, in many cases as a reaction to uh, the appearance of new enemies, and they would be defeated and then find ways to conquer them and expand their empire. Eventually, they began to act on their own to expand their horizons. But fueled by military success, a first class transportation system and political cohesion, the Roman Empire amassed wealth and influence, which was divided amongst a large upper class spread across their whole empire. One of the things that they introduced was the idea that uh, you didn't have to be a Roman from Rome to be a citizen of the empire. It took a while to do that. There's a long history under the Republican Romans where there's a fight over that. But this is one of the things that distinguished the empire in that you could become a Roman by citizenship. Uh, and this was one of their great strengths throughout their history, the idea of converting the peoples they conquered not into conquered and subjugated peoples, but by co-opting their elites and then eventually their merchants and lower classes. They were able to enlarge their empire and the feeling of Romanness, which is one reason why their legacy has lasted as long as it has, despite the fall of the empire. You know, depending on how you look at it, either the Byzantine Empire, more than about 800 years ago, is the last part of that, uh, or with the Western Roman Empire in 476 BC, AD, we're talking more like 1500 years. Despite the division of the Roman Empire into eastern and western parts in the late 4th century and the eventual destruction of the Western Roman Empire, thanks to barbarian invasions and political turmoil, the Byzantine Empire continued to serve as a vital source of demand in silk commerce for centuries. So Rome was the in the Silk Road context was the Western uh, anchor for the trade. It was the reason why uh, silk and other high end commodities were worth transporting across thousands of miles. The Silk Road covered over 4,500 miles, depending on where you measure. So Romans adopted coinage from the Greeks in the 3rd century BC and adapted it for their own purposes, expanding and refining the principles introduced by the Greeks to create their own distinctive coinage style. They became masters of coins as a means of mass communication uh, by using many of the symbols and uh, memes that we think of today. The the distribution of wealth by an emperor, you know, showing emperors as kissing babies and playing up to their audiences, and then also showing military and religious connections that showed the people why their emperor was great and why they should continue to support them. Under the Republic, coinage was used to glorify Rome and her conquests. It was not considered, it was illegal actually to use images of individuals, living individuals, and celebrate them because a republic was a representation of the people, and no individual could be more important than the people as a whole. Over time, as the republic began to falter, individual generals became more powerful, and the coins began to reflect the power and success of these generals. This led to the development of the first imperial coinages under Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Uh, I don't have that shown here, but the classic is the Aidmar coin, where you have Brutus and Cassius uh, representing their assassination of Caesar, who attempted to show himself as uh, the permanent dictator of Rome, and that was a clear undercutting of the standards of the Roman Republic, and yet they showed their own portraits, or Brutus showed his own portrait, showing that the principle was not as important as his own personal glory. Um, so this Roman concept of coinage is the basis for what we think of as money today and continues to have a major influence on our coinage, from design and shape to the continued use of Latin in many modern coin inscriptions, including our own. Plus, that idea that in a republic, you don't show living individuals. We don't show our presidents as living individuals as president. We show them long after they're dead to honor their memory, but not to honor their current power. Because as a republic, no individual can be more important than the people as a whole. And that's a very Roman idea that our founding fathers learned and adopted for their new country. So portraiture on Roman coinage was brutally realistic and designed to portray the individual and their character. The legends and imagery were designed to show the accomplishments and attributes of the ruler in a positive light, from victories to distribution of imperial largesse and public works. So it starts with these images from the first century BC to the first century AD, and you can see changes over time. This is the empire in 117 AD at its greatest extent under Trajan. And you can see that for a very short while, all of Mesopotamia and Assyria, basically to the head of the Persian Gulf, was part of the Roman Empire under Trajan's conquest. They only kept that for a very short time, and the borders for many centuries remained more or less along the Euphrates River, where the Romans and either the Parthians or the Sasanians fought long series of wars over centuries for control of the region. The second century AD, starting with Trajan, was the height of Roman power. And you can see the coins here keep very much in the format of the earlier coins, with the exception that you start to see longer and longer legends at times, as emperors such as Trajan attempted to show all of their accomplishments. This one is a particular favorite of mine, where you have the Emperor Trajan with the legend that he's the best prince. He's the Optimo Augustus. He's the best emperor, and his titles include Dacicus because he conquered Dacia, Germanicus because he conquered Germany, Parthicus because he conquered Parthia, etc., etc. And the reverse of this is an interesting coin, because here he's shown as giving a king to Parthia, Rex Parthis Datus. He is shown on a dais, sitting in his curule chair, the chair of the Roman consuls and emperors, chair of power, with the Parthian, um, with a stereotypical Parthian on his knees receiving the Emperor Parthomespades, who's standing to the left of the Daes as their new king. So you get stories like that that are part of what Roman coins' purpose was to pass on information of this sort. As you go forward, Roman coins start to change with the adoption of Christianity. In the wake of Constantine the First, you start to see imagery where the appearance of the emperor is less important than their general features. What's really important is the regalia that they wear. The diadem has changed to something more complex, as you can see on this coin of Constantine and his followers. And imagery starts to appear increasingly with Christian symbols upon them, and more standardized images of conquest and um, images that show religious contexts, such as the coin of the solidus of Theodosius with the enthroned uh, leaders with halos around their heads, showing the victory of the Augusti. So it's the two Augusti with halos because of the support of God. And the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, the 5th to 15th century AD, where you see different elements of the empire and how it changed over time. Now, Byzantine coinage, which is, the Byzantine Empire, they did not call themselves Byzantines. They were actually Romans. The big difference is that this was the eastern part of the Roman Empire, which had been dominated by the Greek language. It was the standard language in the region was Greek if you wanted to communicate with anybody outside of your particular area. And over time, Latin was supplanted by Greek, and it began to appear on coinage eventually. Now we'll start talking about the Kushans. Now, the Kushans are another empire that's very poorly understood, particularly before 40, 50 years ago. We had some information, but very little written information. They didn't write about themselves. Neither did the Parthians very much. We mainly know about them through the writings of others. In the case of Parthia, we have extensive writings by the Romans and by the Greeks. With the Kushans, there's less literature left by the Romans or the Greeks, but there's a lot of literature left from Chinese sources. And the most important elements of information that we have are from archaeology, in particular the discovery of Kushan coins, which were extensively issued, and by the coin finds, where they're found and everything else, where we have been able to reconstruct uh, the size and importance of the empire, along with Chinese sources and with archaeological and sculptural finds. Otherwise, it's very hard to actually understand just how important they were if we had to limit ourselves to the remaining examples of writing from the Kushans. We'd know next to nothing, and very few of their emperors, their kings. So, encompassing much of Central Asia and parts of northern India, the Kushan Empire was built from the remnants of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom by the Uaz, which was a nomadic tribe from the eastern steppes. A syncretic empire, the Kushans embraced a diverse pantheon which incorporated Greco-Bactrian as their language. They used the Greek script as modified in Bactria, and they were able to usher in, with the foundation of their empire in the early first century AD, about 200 years of relative peace that became critical to the development of the early Silk Roads as they formed this link between basically China and the West, represented by Parthia and the Romans. The name Kushan derives from the Chinese term Guishang, which was the name of one of the branches of the Yuezhi Nomadic Confederation. Um, and they were an Indo-European people who lived in the northwest of China until they were driven west by another group, the Xiongnu, which became critical for a long part of the history of China in around 176 BC. They ended up invading Bactria as they fled from the Xiongnu, and um, they conquered much of that area, modern Afghanistan and Tajikistan, around 135 BC. Uh, Once they were settled, uh, Kujala Kadphises, sorry, I'm not sure how some of these are pronounced. They're unusual spellings of words, but Kujula Kadphises united the disparate tribes in the very early first century AD and gradually wrested control of the area from the Scytho-Parthians, and conquered the rest of the Yuezhi Confederation to create a unified empire based in Afghanistan, modern Afghanistan, and in parts of northwestern India and Pakistan, with a capital near Kabul. Um, they soon began to issue a series of gold coins, which became a standard for the region and were made in imitation of the Roman aureus as far as uh, their purity and weight. Kanishka, the third Kushan emperor, ruled from two capitals, partly showing the scope of the empire. One was at Purashapura, now Peshawar, near the Khyber Pass, and from Mathura in northern India. He ruled in the early to mid second century AD. His empire controlled a large territory ranging from the Aral Sea through present-day Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan into northern India. The Kushans were instrumental in spreading uh, ideas along with continuing the trade process of transporting silk and wine and other things one way or the other. But one of the great legacies is the spread of Buddhism across Central Asia and China. Their their empire was critical in the transformation of Buddhism from basically a mystic philosophy into a religion, a world religion that is one of the great world religions of today. Uh, Several of their emperors, their king of kings, featured Buddhist imagery on their coins, and at least one was a Buddhist. Here are some of their coins. What's really interesting is that there's something like 26 different um, gods and goddesses from ranging from the Greek pantheon to the Zoroastrian imagery to Buddhist and native Indian Hindu imagery that are portrayed on their coins. So they they really demonstrate a religious syncretism. They had a great tolerance for different religions, and apparently uh, didn't experience many of the crackdowns of un, undesirable religions that you saw, such as the Romans with Christianity or the Sasanians with non-Zoroastrian religions, or the Chinese with Buddhism at one point or another. The kings are often displayed as bearded and wearing long coat and trousers in the style of the steppe nomads, and with in conjunction in the style of the Zoroastrian kings, they had flames emanating from their shoulders, and often they're shown sacrificing at a small altar uh, from which flames are coming in front of them. And you see this in uh, three of the second, third, and fourth coins where you see that standard imagery. And then they have just a vast number of gods, anything from uh, Zeus uh, as the supreme ruler to you have Athena, and then you have on the second coin, for example, you have Nandi and Siva. Nandi being the bull, the sacred bull behind the god Siva standing in front. So you have a range of imagery representing multiple religions. The Sasanian Empire. So the Sasanians were the successors to the Parthians, and they founded their empire when Ardashir I, their founder king, revolted in 224 AD. A self-proclaimed heir of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, he was the king of the Parthian province of Persis, which was the heart of the old Achaemenid Persian areas. He revitalized Persian culture and established Zoroastrianism as the unifying state religion. The Sasanians assumed Parthia's strategic role within the Silk Road trade network, as well as an enduring rivalry with the Roman Empire. But unlike the Parthians, the Sasanians viewed themselves as Achaemenid Persians with an old uh, tradition of military conquest, a proud military tradition with a national religion, which the Parthians were not particularly interested in. So they were less tolerant of religious or cultural diversity and valued military prowess more highly than they did economic success, which uh, meant that the Silk Road era took a plunge. The volume of trade in the Silk Roads, particularly through Central Asia, decreased, even though it continued, particularly in the maritime areas to the south. But this was an era. This was the end of the first era of the Silk Road, and they not only did they destroy the Parthians, but they also destroyed the Kushan Empire. Uh, and when you combine that with, so this is the Parthians fell in 224 AD. The Kushans declined over the period of the mid third century, and the Han Dynasty actually collapsed as as a unif as a unified Chinese empire at the same time. Within 15 years of the fall of the Parthians, the Han Empire collapsed, and China broke into three kingdoms to start with, and then went through a period of several hundred years, 360 years of disunity, which meant they're interested in foreign adventures and expansion uh, died, and trade suffered at the same time. So though the trade recovered somewhat during the fourth century, with the recovery of the Roman Empire, which was at that time experiencing the period of the third century where you had up to 25 emperors in a period of 50 years, uh, Rome did recover, but the Silk Road trade didn't recover until the rise of Islam and the revival of Chinese imperial ambitions under the Tang Dynasty in the 7th century. Here's what the Sasanian coinage looked like. They kept the tradition of the Greeks and Parthians. Each emperor showed their own image And the distinguishing element was their hairstyle in part, but also their crowns. So Parthian emperors are distinguished by the crowns. Plus, they do have their names written in Pahlavi around the edges. The Sassanids also introduced a gold coinage, which they adopted from the Roman aureus and also the Kushan dinar. But their standard coinage was again the dram, but with a new design. The They continued roughly the same weight, but now their coins were much thinner on a much larger planchet, though they did have the same weight, which became the model for coinage throughout Central Asia and the later, after Islam conquered the Sasanians, this became the model for their coinage as far as the um, flan goes, the large, thin planchet. And then we go to the Scythians. So one of the key elements of, of disorder, but also a key element in the functioning of the Silk Roads was the nomadic tribes that lived in the steppe areas and periodically invaded the settled sedentary empires. Uh, they provided, in many cases, security and the uh, means of travel across some of these vast distances to carry the goods that were traded. Um, the Scythians, for example, was one of the nomadic groups. They were the earliest ones to appear in our written records. They were mentioned by the ancient Greeks and by the Achaemenid Persians. Uh, we know that they appear archaeologically and historically in the ninth century BC when they migrated westward from Central Asia to southern Russia and the Ukraine in the 8th and 7th centuries BC. Then they attempted to invade the Balkans and they invaded the Persian areas and created quite a problem. They represent some of the earliest of the steppe nomads to adopt two new technologies. The well, three actually. The development of horses that could be ridden by people. They were large enough, in other words, to be saddled and ridden. The development of the compound bow and an organization around that which allowed for a militarized nomadic population, which became very difficult for settled empires to fight against because they were able to move extremely quickly and with a compound bow were able to uh, be very dangerous even against settled empires with armored troops. The bow was able to create havoc and allow the tribes the power to conquer areas which previously they were unable to do. Um, the Scythians remained a force in the area of the Caspian and Black Seas right until the first century AD, becoming the Indo-Scythians, also known as the Indo-Sakas, who invaded northwestern India and formed kingdoms in the wake of the fall of the Kushans. And they introduced coinages based on the coinages they found within the areas that they conquered. So they used a Bactrian script uh, with Greek legends. In some areas, this Indo-Scythian northern satraps tetradrama at the upper left shows Greek script, but not a Greek language. On the right, it's using a Bactrian language, which was an Eastern Iranian dialect, along with the Kharoshthi using Sanskrit, I believe, on the reverse. But the imagery is similar to the imagery that you see on Greek coinages. You have an enthroned king with a goddess, possibly victory, except showing a cornucopia and a laurel wreath for victory in her hands. And so you see these variations of the earlier empires, but using some of the same symbolism. Then we have the rise of Islam, which changed the world forever in the 7th century. Following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 AD, Islam rapidly expanded at the expense of the Byzantine and Sassanid empires of the time. Appearing after the collapse of the first Silk Road in the 4th century AD, Islam stimulated the development of a second Silk Road era and united newly converted regions under the Islamic political and religious authority. The Caliphate, under the Rashidun and Umayyad dynasties, expanded at a phenomenal rate. Central Eurasia was linked through religion and language for the first time, setting the stage for the renewed spread of goods, ideas, and cultures along the Silk Road network. At the death of Muhammad in 632, the leadership of Islam was left in question as he had no sons. Without clear instructions, four of his closest followers were selected in succession as caliphs. Um, and a result of this was the eventual permanent division of Islam into two major sects, the Sunni and Shia, which have contended for the dominance ever since. But if you look at this map, you can see just how quickly they were able to conquer a huge area, in part because of the existence of the Silk Road trade network. At this point, they knew what was at the other end of the trade networks to the west and to the east, as opposed to earlier conquerors, where often they would have very poor knowledge of what was where they were going. For example, Alexander uh, was marching when he marched to the east to areas either completely not unknown or virtually unknown, subject of mythology to the Greeks, and it was a major reason why his army mutinied at the Indus River. Was they were marching continuously into more and more areas, and many of them were totally unknown and the subject of myths that suggested that it was very dangerous or foolhardy to go any further, and so they mutinied and turned his army around. The Muslims, on the other hand, had an advantage where the territories were known, the peoples were parts of larger empires and were easier to conquer than um, the Achaemenid Persians and others had experienced. Their coinage was their coinage was new as well. They abandoned the old Greek and Roman usage of imagery as part of their religion, where the use of the graven image of animals or people was forbidden. And so they developed a coinage based on the written word uh, taken from the Quran. So you'll see often on the obverse, you'll see lines from the Quran, sometimes on the reverse as well. And then the legend that goes around the central um, verse is where you find the date and the caliph at the time, and other information such as the mint um, written on the coins. But this gave a very different uh, appearance to the coins. And this style of coin spread all the way across North Africa and Central Asia.
Just a heads up, Doug, we have about 5 minutes before we need to wrap it up and open it up for the next presenter. So just wanted
Yes.
to let you know.
Yeah, we're at the very end now. So
All right.
The Mongols created the first contiguous empire across all of Eurasia, And this created a new era, the final era of the Silk Road, where for the first time you start to see uh, diplomats, merchants going the whole distance from one end to the other end. Previously, it was possible, but very rarely done. But now you start to hear more and more about people going not only from uh, central China to India, but all the way to the Western European courts, including meeting with the Pope and meeting with the French and English kings, for example. A representative envoy of the Mongol Khan named Raban Shalma traveled all the way to the West and met with the King of England at the time, Edward I, and met with the French king and the Pope, trying to get allies to to support Christians in the East, in Central Asia, and also fight against the enemies of the Mongol Khan. Um, so the Mongols, despite their reputation for death and destruction, which was well deserved, they were they were also uh, by their unification of Eurasia able to create the first for the first time a single uh, entity which protected trade throughout this vast area, and it created a huge uptick in the trade, uh, along with the possibility of people like Marco Polo able to go and become an envoy of the Mongol Khan and be able to return to Italy and tell his story. Their coins adopted the Islamic model and became very common throughout the region and influenced their those regions for centuries to come, um, and show the importance of these coins in trade throughout northern India all the way to Russia and Hungary and beyond. And then we have the history of China, and I'll end with that. The Chinese, under the Han Empire, which was the first expansive empire of China, they moved out of their traditional centers in the Yalu and Yangtze River valleys and unified as a single empire, and were able to expand in search of allies against the Xiongnu, the tribe that I mentioned earlier, the nomadic tribe. They moved across through the Taklamakan Desert. These areas were not necessarily directly under their control, but they became allies and uh, dependents on the Chinese, and they created the first um, basically large Eastern um, Chinese presence in this region, which allowed for the formation of the Silk Road and this vast exchange of goods that lasted for almost 1,500 years, all based on the initial impetus of the Han Chinese dynasty, which was founded in 206 BC and collapsed in 220 AD. And sorry, I went the wrong way. And we'll end with the coins that developed in China. The distinctive feature of Chinese coins is the fact they were cast instead of struck. Casting can potentially speed up the reduction of coins enormously, but at the cost of detail and quality. This is especially suited for the rapid production of large numbers of low denomination coins with simple designs, which is just what the Chinese wanted for their coinage. China did not develop a successful coinage in silver or gold until the 19th century. Instead, they used gold and silver ingots right up through the 20th century for their larger transactions. In part, this is explained by the different way that the Chinese looked at their coinage. They were intended primarily as circulating pieces of low value that were used by peasants and uh, other people as basically the way to do daily transactions at small levels. You could buy uh, a drink or other things. A Greek silver tetradrachm was a week's worth of pay, as opposed to a cash coin, which you'd have to have several of to buy, say, an alcoholic drink or a meal. The close connection with their well, the Chinese civilization developed in relative isolation. They had no other civilized competitors nearby for the first 1,000 years or so of their development, and they developed a civilization, a culture that had a strong bureaucratic element to organize the regular harvesting the of the grain and all that, but also to develop systems of agriculture, including the use of canals, the use of uh, water systems to expand agriculture, took organization and took a bureaucratic organization that became interested more in continuity. And part of that was the issuance of money, not to celebrate any particular emperor, but money that they could keep track of to use for smaller uh, exchange. There was no need for the propaganda because they had no competition. There was nobody, there weren't multiple emperors from different uh, groups trying to contend. They were simply trying to promote the stable continuity of the existing organization. Um, And so you see coins developing from the early period, the copper wuzu, which basically has a weight or essentially denomination, a half ounce of copper. And then interestingly, you had the Wang Mang interregnum, where a usurper took control of the Han Chinese Empire for a short period in order to uh, reassert the old values and introduced things like a copy of the old style knife coinage in the hope that it would reassert the good old days as opposed to the bad Han dynasty at the time. He was revolting against abuses, but the Han took over again and their empire continued for another 150 years after that. The Tang dynasty introduced the four character coinage, which included the reign name of the emperor along with the denomination. So now they were able to keep track of which coins were issued at what time. But again, there was no imagery, and this writing was only accessible to the highly educated upper middle and elite classes. So they were not intended as a propaganda, more as a token of who issued it at what time from a bureaucratic purpose. And then the last piece here is the Chinese Five Dynasties era, where these coins followed the same tradition as before and continued for a long time afterwards, with the main change being after the end of the Silk Road eras, the introduction of mint and other information on the reverse. And with that, I will end as I'm running a little long here and welcome any questions if we have some time. Thank you.
All right, we're going to have to go ahead and cut it there so we can get set up for the next talk. Thank you so much, Doug, for taking the time to put this together and have such a thoroughly researched presentation. It was very great. Next up, we'll have Mark Engler starting at 4:30 in just a few minutes as part of the Nebraska State Showcase series. So I hope you all can stick around for that one. Regardless, thank you for joining us. Thank you for presenting. Have a good day.
Thank you.